Hello friends, now we get into the most enigmatic part of Ben Hogan's wonderful book, a topic which has been the subject of discussion for the 70 years or so since it was published. And that is his description of the attitudes and activities of particularly the left wrist. And of course, he was also quite unique in that he was using scientific terms to describe these things, something that I don't recall any previous authors doing. So I'm going to define the words that he used and add a couple more just for clarity, so that subsequent videos are, I hope, making more sense. So the term particularly that he used, supination and its opposite, pronation, refers to the disposition of the left forearm. Pronation is where the thumb is turned inward, like a Roman emperor deciding the fate of a gladiator, and the opposite is supination. Then we have flexion and extension, and a third one, which is quite simply ulnar deviation and radial deviation. And of course, both of those, both hands are subject to those same movements. They're just mirror images of each other. And so as a consequence, now we can start talking about what he said in his book. And I'm going to add what I think he meant and what I have found to be useful for my clients.
Hogan's very particular hand action going through the ball was a product of some geometry, even reaching back to how he stood. He stood with a relatively erect posture. He was slightly below average height, stood erect, and although he said that the pane of glass resting on the line through the ball to the target with a hole cut out for the shoulders was the plane of the swing, he also acknowledged that the hands and arm were below that at address, but that they would be, he thought, parallel with it halfway through the backswing. Never quite understood that one. But anyway, the big important point is that there, in his posture, was relatively little space between the top of the hands and that pane of glass. So he didn't have to make as many adjustments. Imagine the more modern style, where there is the preferred idea of the arms hanging straight down from the neck, and this angle being more defined, a smaller angle. So instead of 160 degrees, it might be 140. Now that means that the distance between the left shoulder and the club is shorter at address, but you've got to fit that back in there. And you can come back with your hands just as low. But in fact, many people are applying force by pulling up very hard with the left side of their body. And I don't know which one comes first. Pulling up makes space for the arms and club to straighten out. And as I mentioned in the last video, it's actually straightening out of the wrist that is uncocking them. So modern golfers pull up a lot, and their hands are substantially higher at the point of impact than they were at address. Now, Ben Hogan, and in fact the most modern version, which would be Bryson DeChambeau, great champion, because they start with the hands and club more on that pane of glass, then they're pulling more backwards than they are upwards, because they no longer have to make up that geometric difference. And so they pull backwards. And of course, if they release the club early, that would mean the ball goes left. So Ben Hogan, of course, very famously wanted to hang on to it, keeping the left wrist, he said, high and bowed. High because it's really a down movement that uncocks the wrist. Hello, friends. Ben Hogan was the first author of a golf book of whom I'm aware who started to use the scientific terms of pronate and supinate. And that's the term given to having the forearm, and particularly the left one, which was the one he mostly referred to, either turning inward or outward. Now, he thought that and he said the hand and the wrist would be supinating going through the ball. That means turning outward. But almost a few sentences later, it started to get very murky, because he was advocating a shape of the wrist, which he described as higher with the wrist and bowed in this fashion, where the wrist bone was nearer to the target. Now, you'll see a lot of modern champions arriving in that shape at the top of the swing. And just a generation after Ben Hogan, you had people like Lee Trevino, Arnold Palmer, Tom Watson, all in this shape. But in his day, it was unfamiliar. And he, in fact, at the end of the backswing, had such a what I call a counter scroll of the wrist, where the knuckles are folded back toward the wristwatch, that it was described as cuppy, where this was quite a distinct angle, and that made the club face hang more vertically in what is called an open position. That means resistant to going to the left, which was a big deal for him. So in this position, you can hinge your wrist farther, and he had the most intense hinge of the wrists of anybody. His shaft angle, the angle between the left arm and the shaft, was very acute, especially as he pulled down. Now, you can't accomplish that with the knuckles, what I call scrolled, where they're rolled over here. And just so you know, the technical term for that is flexion, and this is extension. Now, the third term is this is ulnar deviation, and this is radial deviation, and that comes into play. And here's why. When he hinged his wrists as intensely as he did, that sort of, if you hold the club in front of you, it's an upward movement. And then the downward one is actually what's happening with uncocking of the wrists. We tend to think of it as a side-to-side movement, but it's only side-to-side because the left arm is supinating. The wrists, however, are doing something different. If you straighten out your wrist too early and too much, you're going to end up with the knuckles of the left hand folded under. And watch the club, it closes. And so he had to delay that. So straightening out the wrists to get the full power did this same thing of reaching the ball, of course, and also closing the club face. So he had to hold on and swing in to out to make sure that it didn't go left. So it's actually a straightening of the wrists in this dimension that accomplished the shape that he advocated. And he had to work very hard to hold on to it, which gave him that very iconic follow through.